On today's show, we'll be talking about strange creatures, doppelgangers, miniature spacemen, and much more. All coming up on this episode of Paranormal Mysteries. Thank you for joining me and welcome. I am your host, as always, Nick Ryan. I hope that everyone's had a great week. And before we start, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for tuning in and supporting the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe, share, and review the podcast. This supports us by helping new listeners to discover the show. And if you'd like to support us even further by becoming a patron or by donating, please visit us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. These links and others can be found in the show notes. And if you've encountered the paranormal and would like to share your story, please email me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com. All experiences, no matter how big or small, are always welcome. And with that in mind, today's first story comes to us from Lydia. And Lydia's story is called My Haunted House. Lydia says, I have previously shared my story about my haunted childhood home. If I remember correctly, it was in the Halloween episode. Well, I have a bit of a developing update to share now. To give some context, I grew up in an 1800s farmhouse in rural Midwestern America. Creepy things often happened, the usual ghost activity and humanoid figures around the property. I used a Ouija board and allowed something to enter the home unknowingly. It haunted me until I couldn't take it any longer, and my mother had the house blessed. Now, these creatures wander the property. I left at 18 with the intention of never coming back, but I recently lost my job due to COVID, forcing me to move back into the house that tormented me throughout my teen years. In late November, I moved back in with my mom. At first, everything was normal, nothing out of the ordinary. My mom had mentioned how she rarely experienced anything since I had left, nearly 7 years ago, and nothing was ever crazy, just the occasional knock or light flickering. This was incredibly reassuring, as I had been terrified to stay in this house again. Everything was fine until December 23rd. It had snowed for the first time since I had been back. I went to the back door to let the dogs out that morning, and I saw long, skinny footprints leading to the side of the house where there wasn't even a door. It was bizarre, but I wrote it off as an animal that couldn't get its legs all the way out of the snow when walking, causing the weird prints. Later that morning, as I'm in my room, I walked by my second-story window, and I noticed a large handprint with long, skinny fingers on the glass. I stood in the window and looked down to see the footprints directly below. Imagining the sheer height of whatever touched my bedroom window makes me nauseous to think about it. I immediately told my mother, who suggested that we go buy some curtains. It was the best idea I had ever heard. We get to the car, and my mom notices a similar handprint on the trunk. We open the door to see the car absolutely ransacked. It was as if the car was picked up, shaken, and then put back down. My mom called the police to report the incident just in case anything came up missing. Stuff did, but it was all mine. A pair of shoes, my headphones, a hat, random stuff, but it all belonged to me. Knowing this, we also mentioned the handprint on my window to the police. The police concluded someone was probably watching me, and to just be careful because there wasn't much else they could do at this point. That evening, I hung blackout curtains over my windows, and I heard a constant tapping all night. It was not a tree. There aren't any within 200 feet of my window. After this, I basically stayed locked away in the house and did my absolute best to avoid windows without closed curtains. However, whatever I allowed into this house as a teen absolutely knows I am home and is working hard to get my attention. I still hear the tapping at night, and I sleep with the TV on to drown it out. It's leaving me things at the doorstep. At first it was my stolen shoes, but they were muddy and smelled like actual death. My mom put them in the curb trash. Sometimes it leaves dead birds. Sometimes it's rocks. All I know is my mother and I never touch it, and we never verbally or physically acknowledge it. From listening to this podcast and others, I know never to accept gifts from the other side or paranormal entities, as it is always more than you bargain for. You can feel the energy of the land changing from the ordinary normal vibe I felt when I first returned to this negative anger that scares me to no end. My mom and I do our best to keep the house light and clean of negativity. As time goes on, though, I get more scared of what is building up and what it wants from me. Telling other people in this way gives me a sense of catharsis and validation in what I am and have experienced is real. Thank you, and I will probably write again with an update. Right now, though, I will conclude with I am looking for other living arrangements and jobs for me and my mother's safety. Our next story of the night comes to us from Sarah Marie, and Sarah Marie's story is called Levitating Astronaut Entity. Sarah Marie says, "Hi Nick, I've spent the last 3 weeks plowing all the episodes, and I have to say I love this podcast. Thank you for creating a space for all us paranormal believers to share our stories. I personally prefer the longer stories featured, and therefore I am not going to apologize in advance for my lengthy feature. So I live in Sweden, and I grew up in an Arctic town located well above the polar circle. The small town of Kiruna is widely known across Europe as a space town, as we host the Swedish Space Corporation, and we have a space base located just outside of town. We are also known for our ice hotel, and when I was a child, our city hosted an event called the Snow Festival, where artists from all over the world came and carved out beautiful sculptures in large blocks of snow and ice in the local park. It's in this park that my strange encounter took place, and I believe it might be connected to the fact that our city has a relationship to space. I am curious to find out if you or your listeners share my belief. As I said before, this took place in our local snow sculpture park. I was a small child, maybe around 6 or 7, when this took place. Me and my friend were playing around the sculptures. We were the only ones there at the time. Being a small town, it was not unusual for little children to roam around without parental supervision. As we were playing, I suddenly got this strange feeling that I was being watched, like something in the atmosphere shifted, and the air around us felt dense and clouded by energy I can't describe. I was just about to call out to my friend that I felt like something was wrong when I saw something move in the corner of my eye. I then turned around, and I saw something that I have never seen before. Peeping out from behind a big block of ice were these 2 small creatures. At first I could only see their heads, but as I stood there in awe, paralyzed not by fear, but more like in wonder, they both came out from behind the sculpture and stood only a few feet in front of me. They were 2 small creatures that resembled astronauts. I say astronauts because they both had big rounded helmets that were slightly larger than the rest of their bodies, and the front of their helmets were jet black. I could not see any facial features. The rest of their body was dressed in a white suit that very much resembled an astronaut suit, but they were small like a child, maybe like a 5 or 6-year-old in height. They just stood there, staring at us from behind their jet black helmets, and although I couldn't see their eyes, I could definitely feel them staring at us, and up to this point, my friend had not yet seen them. I turned around again to tell her that she needed to see this, and when she did, something really strange happened. Up until this point, it might have just been 2 kids in costumes playing in the park, but when my friend saw them, she just screamed at me to run, so we did. We ran to another sculpture to hide from them, and when we looked around to see if we had lost them, we saw them reappear again, this time moving towards us. However, they were not walking, they were just moving closer to us in a slow-motion movement without lifting their feet. This really freaked us out. I had a very strong feeling that they were curious, slightly observing us in the distance. We ran as fast as our legs would carry us, and once across the street, I turned around once more to see if they had followed us, and they had, but only to the edge of the park, where they just stood still and looked at us silently, dead still. Everything about them was so odd. The way that we could feel them stare, the way they moved, and the fact that they just chased us around the park. I was so scared I ran into a cafe and asked to borrow the phone to call my mother to come pick us up. What was this? Of course, my mother did not know how to react to me being so scared to have seen astronauts in the park. But the way their feet never touched the ground scared me for life. I know what we saw, and it was not from this world. Many years later, as an adult, I had an intense UFO encounter in the same city, and I'll share that story in the future. Thank you for reading this, and keep up the good work. And thank you again for creating this platform for all us experiencers to share our stories. I truly believe there is much more out there than what meets the eye. If anyone has ever seen anything like this, I would love to hear from them. Kind regards, Sarah Marie. Our next story of the night comes to us from Cadence, and Cadence's story is called The Noises and Fallings. Cadence says, I believe in the paranormal, and honestly, I would like to investigate it. I can't explain what has been happening to me and my family in our houses. My parents are divorced, so you would think that there wouldn't be a problem in both houses. But you see, that's the thing I'm worried about. It all started at my dad's house at 12 years old. It would normally happen at night, around 1 to 3:30 a.m., and sometimes during the day. I was laying in bed playing games on my phone when I heard something walking in the hallway, so I went to go peek out and saw nothing but the light of our printer. I thought that was a little weird, but I passed it off as being my brother's until it walked by my room. I looked out again, but saw nothing. I was scared at the moment, so I went to sleep. A couple days had passed when I was laying in my bed around 2 a.m., and I heard someone stomping on our porch as our dogs were barking like something was there, until it all stopped. I looked out the window to see if anybody was out there, but I saw nothing besides the moonlight. I went to bed scared of what was going on, and the next morning I was sitting on my bed playing video games when I hear something moving around and then fall in my closet. As scared as I was, I grabbed my pocket knife and opened the door to see nothing was in there, but things were on the floor that were originally up. These things started to repeat every night, but the weird thing is, I would always feel uneasy even when something wasn't happening. I went to my mom's house one weekend, and everything was fine, until I was laying in bed around 1 a.m. It was very dark in my room, and I was playing on my phone again. I suddenly got a wave of uneasiness, and I was terrified for no reason that I knew of, until I heard heavy breathing by my bed, too heavy to be my dog or cat. I was so scared that my blood ran cold, and I was stiff. It would go on for 30 to 45 minutes, but it wouldn't stay in one place. It would walk to the foot of my bed and continue breathing heavily, but when it would move, I wouldn't hear creaking on my floors. I thought it was just my mind, but it would repeat every night I was there. Before I heard the breathing, I would hear my top bunk on my bunk bed creak like someone was on it. I thought I was imagining it until one night my cousin stayed in my room for a night. Everything was going good until the next morning when she looked at me and said, "Do you hear it too? At night, in your room?" I laughed a bit until I noticed that she was dead serious. I looked at her and told her what happened to me, and it seemed like we had the same things happen. I don't know what is going on in my house, and sometimes I think it follows me because I would feel the same things at a friend's house or a family's house. If you know what is happening, then please tell me, because I don't know what to do. And it still happens to this day. Thank you for listening or reading my story. Our next story of the night comes to us from Barb, and Barb's story is called Strange Experience. Barb says, "Hi Nick. About 6 years ago, I had to take my almost 2-year-old to the hospital because she rolled off the bed and fell, and I was worried if she hit her head. She was 100% fine, and the doctor told me signs to look for the next time it happens. So my mom drove me home, and we were standing in the kitchen, and I saw my husband standing by the stove, 5 feet away. He didn't say anything, and then just ran out of the room and up the stairs, faster than I have ever seen someone run. My mom then said to me, "Wasn't Nick just standing over there?" And I said, "You saw him too?" She said yes, and I then went upstairs to where Nick's game room was, and Nick was playing a game on the Xbox. I asked him if he had just been in the kitchen, and he said, "No, I've been in this room for 2 hours. I made a snack 2 hours ago, and haven't left." I told him that my mom and I both saw him there just before I came up here. He said no again, and that he'd been here and hadn't heard us come home. That situation still confuses me, because it's the one and only time that has happened. Thanks for reading my story, and I'll send in more later. Have a great day, and love your podcast. Thanks, Barb. Our next story of the night comes to us from Sarah, and Sarah's story is called Strange Noise in an Abandoned Mine. Sarah says, "Hi Nick, I came across your podcast a few weeks ago and have been listening on my commute to work. I enjoy hearing others' stories, especially ones detailing what others experience in the woods. I am an avid hiker, and to be honest, it makes me a little more scared to go out, especially alone. Luckily, I haven't had any experiences alone, other than the feeling of being watched from a distance. But that's not why I'm writing. I want to share my story from 2017, when a friend and I were out hiking to an abandoned mine. You see, we live in an area in the Appalachian Mountains that is highly geared towards outdoor tourism and is a heaven for those who love outdoor recreation. It is very old geologically and is filled with history, largely dealing with the Civil War and coal mining. There are old mines that closed between the 1950s and 1970s, and a lot of the old roads and railroad beds were converted to trails by the National Park Service, and the mines were closed off to prevent people from entering. One particular mine site is my favorite to visit, but due to a landslide around 2014 or 2015, I hadn't hiked it in a few years, until one day when we decided to hike the trail. It's about 2 miles from where we parked to the site. About a half mile before the main site lies an opening where the old fan house sat. We arrived at the site and pedaled around a little, taking photos before continuing on the trail. I walked up to the opening and peered through the steel bars that blocked the opening. I started hearing a low rumble coming from within, sounding like the mine was collapsing deep within. I called to my friend to come and listen. It gradually kept getting louder. I then realized after a few seconds that it could not be the mine collapsing due to the way the booms sounded. It was getting closer, and it sounded more like it was being done on purpose. It reminded me of explosions. Mind you, this mine has not been used since the 1960s, and there are no mines close enough that are in current operation to have caused this sound. She came over and she heard the sound as well, and then we decided to move on. As I moved away from the opening, we could still hear the sound coming from within. About a month later, we decided to go back and we had another friend with us. That particular day, we set out to hike the entire trail, which is about 10 miles one way. We arrived at the first mine opening and stopped so our friend could explore around a little before moving on. I walked up to the opening like I did last time and heard the exact same sound. They both came over and heard the same thing as well. About a minute or so after listening, we thought we heard the sound of people's voices coming around the bend of the trail, so we decided to move on. Every so often, my friend and I will talk about that noise and can't figure out exactly what it was. I haven't been back to that site since, though I hope to return very soon. I attached a photo below of the opening if you wish to share. I do have plenty of stories from our hikes that I will send in time for you to read. We've often discussed the idea of time warps, portals, and alternate dimensions to try and explain the things that we've seen and heard. I struggle some to believe in the paranormal. I grew up in a Christian home and was always told that these sorts of things were demonic. A few years ago, I left religion and became a skeptic, though I do admit that there are things that science can't explain, and I try and remain open-minded about things. Thank you for taking the time to read. I hope you and all the listeners stay safe. Sarah. I will go ahead and post Sarah's photo of the mine opening for everyone to see. Our next story of the night comes to us from Kyle, and Kyle's story is called Medjugorje Experience. Kyle says, "Hello, I live in the state of Iowa. I recently discovered your podcast on Pandora, and I love listening to it as I work my overnight retail stocking job. I actually just finished your episode 25, titled The Devil Upstairs, and it reminded me of an experience my family has had a long time ago. My mother's side of my family has always been very religious, almost to a fault sometimes. At the time, I was about 9 years old, and my great-grandmother had paid for my grandmother, my mom, and I to go on a religious retreat to Medjugorje for around a week. A few things actually went on to happen here that we weren't able to explain. First, we had started a tour that would lead us to Apparition Hill, a spot where the Virgin Mary supposedly appeared back in the 80s. I'm not one to believe in most religious things, but upon arriving at Apparition Hill, my grandma took a few pictures of the surrounding area, and after we had had the film developed, we noticed in one of the pictures, specifically a picture taken of the Queen of Peace statue. It had something very strange in it. In the picture, the statue or surroundings were barely visible, and were instead replaced with a bright white ball of light, covering the upper half of the statue, with streams of rainbow light emanating from the ball of light. To make it even more surprising, if you look carefully, the ball of light has features resembling a woman's face. I do not have a digital copy of this picture to send you at this time, as the picture was taken on a disposable camera, but I will try to send you the image once I get a scanned copy from my grandmother herself, as the picture is framed and hung over her television. The other thing that happened was during the Mass that we attended before we left. A lot of people have reported strange things happening to them during the Masses, such as hearing voices and feeling a hand touch them, or stuff like that. Before Mass began, my grandmother had been praying the rosary, as she would normally do. Just before she had finished, we noticed her suddenly jump up, gasp, and start weeping. As we rushed over to see what had happened, she opened her hands to show us her rosary. What had once been a rosary made of oak wood beads and string was now a rosary covered in gold. Not solid gold, but a thin gold film that scratched off with your fingernail. We showed it to the priest after Mass, and he said that this has happened before to people who pray the rosary in the church, and that it never happens when the rosary is being looked at, and my grandmother had held it in her hands while looking up at the cross, so nobody had been looking at it. Even 15 years later, I still don't know what to make of this. I know it sounds absurd and unbelievable, but I can promise you that this actually happened. Thank you for reading this, and keep up the amazing podcast. As we come to the end of tonight's episode, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the show. And a special thank you goes out to Lydia, Sarah Marie, Cadence, Barb, Sarah, and Kyle for sharing their experiences with all of us. If you've witnessed something that you can't explain, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit us at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a safe and healthy weekend, and we'll see you back here on Monday with our next episode. From everyone at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you so much for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.